All right, so this is going to be a unique Q&A because Dan, you are an artist, but you are also someone who does their homework. The Cosmoetica has about, I'd say, maybe 300 or so hours in which you talk about life, art, and politics, different people worldwide, people of different races, religion, sexuality, etc. And you lived in three disparate parts of the country, which was New York City, Twin Cities, Minnesota, I believe,
Hmm.
and now Austin, Texas. So, being an artist and somebody who's imbibed three very different parts of the country, I like to sort of hear your political evolution and the way you sort of have interpreted life between living in those different parts of the country and how it's affected you today.
Okay, well, I mean, is there a specific question? You're sort of asking a Grant,
Um,
what's your view of world history? Okay, I mean,
well, I was just giving an overall, a
uh,
general for what I want to accomplish today. So
okay.
I will begin with the first, more specific part of it, which is sort of life in New York,
Hmm.
where you were born, and sort of the first inspirational spark for you as an artist, and how you evolved politically.
Well, I was born February 2nd, 1965, Groundhog's Day, and it was back then called Groundhogs with an apostrophe, a possessive apostrophe. It wasn't until the Bill Murray movie that they called it Groundhog Day, which makes no sense because we talk about President's Day, not President Day. Um, and I was born to a woman who her name was Catherine Finsland. She was a 21-year-old single mother. She came to, she had conceived me in Minnesota. She was going to the University of Minnesota. She then got pregnant without her family knowing it, moved for a summer, or for almost a year, I guess, to New York, gave birth to me with the Spence Chapin Adoption Agency, still going strong. Uh, and I spent 2.5 years uh, in foster care until I was 2 3/4 years old, or however old it might have been. Uh, my birth mother then went back and married my natural father. They had a son together, my natural brother, and then they adopted a black child who was about a year and a half older than my other brother. So they grew up together as brothers. I found them in 1991. My natural mother had died in 85 from tongue cancer. I never met her. For about almost a decade, I was in touch with my natural family. Then, after I met and married Jessica, they came to our wedding celebration. They did not get along, I guess, with Jessica's family or my mother and friends. And I haven't seen them for almost 20 years. For a couple of years, I tried to keep in touch, but they just sort of snubbed me. Jessica is very bitter about it. I'm much more laissez-faire. As far as going back to my growing up, I was adopted by, or my natural father's name was Alan Sturger. Uh, my dad and my mom, who adopted me, were George Walter Schneider and Helen Meta Schneider. My mom was half German, half Lithuanian. My dad was a full German. He actually was known as George by business associates, but known as Eddie by his friends because his mother, oddly enough, didn't like the name George Walter Schneider that she gave him on the birth certificate. So when he was christened, she called him August Edward because his father's name was August or Gus, and so personal people knew him as Eddie. Um, I was adopted when they were 50 and 42, no, 50 and 44 respectively. They were the oldest people to ever be granted an adoption of a child in New York State at the time, because I had a lot of medical problems. I have an adopted sister who's 4 years younger than me. She was adopted in 1970 at about a year old. Um, and I grew up in Ridgewood, New York. Ridgewood, for the first 9 years, or from 7 years, from 2 to 9. I have no idea where I was, or was I with multiple foster homes for the first 2.5 years. There are a few photos of me playing with a young boy who's probably a couple of years older than me, but I have no idea whether that was Long Island or New Jersey or Connecticut or Westchester, New York, or wherever. Um, and so my dad and my mom were working class people. My mom was a bookkeeper. My mom was very smart. She always got me books. She knew how smart I was. I remember she bought a set of Funkin' Wagnalls Encyclopedia, 1972 edition, from me at the supermarket. In those days, there were things called green stamps, or you could buy things uh, on time, meaning that every week, I guess every other week, the 26 volumes of the encyclopedia came out, and so my mom would buy them. And that encyclopedia was with me for about 25 years. I wish I still had it. I stupidly got rid of them about 25 years ago. I wish I had it just for the sentimental value. Just like I wish I had a lot of things that I had gotten rid of. But my mom encouraged my love of books, reading. My dad, on the other hand, was a working class guy. He drove uh, a medical van, a health van for the health department of New York. He was a working class guy. I remember going to work with him as a boy sometimes during the summer when I was off from school, driving along with him on his van. My dad was very outgoing. He was very well liked. People at work or wherever would wave and eddy. My mom was very introverted. My mom was very smart, functionarily smart, not a visionary, not a creationary. If you know my three posits, three intellect posits. And my dad was a union guy. He he had gotten fired from a job for trying to unionize in the 1940s or 50s. He worked at a glass factory. I myself have been in four unions over the years: the Union of Food and Commercial Workers, the Teamsters, the Communications Workers of America, and AFSCME, the Association of Federal, State, County, Municipal Employees. I'm not currently unionized. In Texas, there aren't any unions, so for the last 17 years, I have not been in any union. Um, but my dad was a Democrat. He was an FDR New Deal Democrat. He grew up there. He had served in the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. That was a civilian sort of like army that was enacted to counteract the Great Depression that would go around. And he worked in Idaho and Washington State as a logger, building roads and building towns and building whatever the hell they were building back then, state parks. My mom, as I said, was a bookkeeper. She always earned more money than my dad. And interestingly enough, my dad was never someone who really cared about that the woman was bringing in more money. They couldn't have children. My mom had, I guess, an underdeveloped uterus, so she couldn't conceive. So we were adopted. The neighborhood I grew up in, Ridgewood, was a very mafia, Goodfellas type neighborhood. Um, I've got the New York quartet that I have. There are mobsters littered throughout the whole of that work, and these types of people I knew. Um, my dad hated them. My dad hated the mafia. My dad hated Frank Sinatra. My mom says it was because Frank Sinatra was the singer at an Atlantic City hotel when they got married and went on their honeymoon. But my dad claims it was because of his ties to the mafia. So my dad hated people like that who corrupted unions and things of that nature. My mom was probably a Democrat. Neither of them were religious. I wasn't religious when I was 9 years old. I said I'm not going to go to church anymore. I didn't believe that bullshit, and neither of them had a problem with it. Um, in the 1980s, my first election that I could vote in was 1983, and I think was that no, that wasn't a mayoral race. It was an off year, so I guess I voted for whoever. 1984, I voted in the presidential race for the first time. I voted for Mondale over Reagan, and I lost. Then I voted for Dukakis in '88. He lost. I voted for Clinton in '92. He won, but I soon regretted that because he was a scumbag. I wouldn't have voted Republican. Uh, '96, I voted for Ralph Nader. 2000, I voted for Ralph Nader. '04, I voted for Ralph Nader. I should have voted for Nader in '08, but I voted for goddamn Obama. I voted for him in 2012, and I should have known better because he didn't do anything in the first 4 years. 2016, I voted for Jill Stein, and I will be voting third party or independent. I'm not certain yet. I may vote Green. I may vote for Mark Charles, an American Indian who's running for president. I may vote for some other thing. I'm doing actually I did my second presidential uh, interview with a minor party candidate, and I've got one scheduled for later this week. So I'm a political independent. I'm a social liberal. I generally thought of myself as a centrist. Most of my views, though, are considered probably generally left wing, but most people in this country now support those views, so I can't really say they're left wing. They are the center, and we live in a country where, oddly enough, we have a right wing candidate in Joe Biden for the Democrats and a far right wing candidate in Donald Trump for the Republicans who are running, even though the policies of progressives are probably approved by 60% or more of the people. And this is the power of money. So that's a short history of me and politics in general.
So you seem to really be well, I don't know if I want to say really be, but it sounds like you are keen on getting a third party going in this country. It sounds like you are very, very frustrated with the establishment in terms of the Democratic and the Republican Party.
I'd,
Uh,
I, I'd like to see 10 or 12 parties. I think the only way that you can get cooperation is if you break power up. You know, if you look, for example, at corporations when they're run by a few rich people and rich boards, corporate boards, these companies suck. They treat their workers bad. They pollute the environment. They don't care about animals. They don't care about consumers. But if you look at the best companies in every field, generally when you have a company that's employee owned, they tend to way outdo corporations because there's not a single person that can get rich. And so everyone has a stake in something. You have to give people a stake in something for them to care. Because most people, even those who have the best intentions, are usually selfish, self centered, solipsistic, greedy, venal. Even the best people are that way. So you have to give them a stake so that you use their venality and their own greediness and self centeredness to a greater good that they don't realize.
so it's really interesting to me because you have voted so far, from what I understand, it sounds like you voted all Democrat before you started voting third party. So from Clinton and then to Obama, and you said both presidents did not, you were not satisfied with both their presidencies. And I really would like to know why specifically, because I think they're both, when you look at like presidential ratings, I would say I think Clinton's rated higher than Obama, but they're both pretty high.
Yeah,
So
and
what
I could make a good case that Obama is the best president of my lifetime. But let's see. I was born in '65. Lyndon Baines Johnson faked the start to the Vietnam War. He was good on some social policies, but the Vietnam War was such a catastrophe. I you at your age have no idea how this was the closest we came to a second civil war was the Vietnam War. It was a disaster. He was, and so that negated any positives that Johnson did. Richard Nixon doubled down on Vietnam, even though he promised to get us out. He then and Nixon, other than Vietnam and Watergate, was actually not that bad of a president for a Republican, especially. He was what was known would be known now as a liberal Republican, but he was a psychopath. He was truly paranoid, and Watergate authorizing a burglary. Not even Donald Trump, as far as we know, has done that. So he was a horror show. Then we had Gerald Ford, who was a bumbling idiot, who just served for 2 years in between. Jimmy Carter didn't have a clue how to lead people, didn't have any political effectiveness, and even he, who's considered maybe the most decent guy in my lifetime to have served as president, looked the other way at murderous dictators that the U.S. supported. You can't be supporting people who are committing genocide and claim that you're a good human being. Uh, then we had Ronald Reagan. And to me, Ronald Reagan and the 1980 election is where this country really went from 1945 to 1980. The middle class came. That 35-year period was probably the best socially and economically for most people. Blacks and some other minorities, Native Americans were not included, but for working class whites and generally poorer people, it was better, even for those blacks and Native Americans. Since 1980, Ronald Reagan, uh, the era of greed was unleashed. Ronald Reagan was senile. He was a racist. He ignored the AIDS crisis, which we're seeing a much more quickly evolving similarity in Trump's ignorance of the COVID crisis now. Um, Ronald Reagan was an absolute, total, and utter failure and disaster as a president. People say he's successful. Yeah, he was successful at being bad. George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, knew better, but he signed on with Reagan for power. He was a guy who had run the CIA. He was a spook. He sanctioned murders. This is a guy who then became president. He only lasted 4 years. Clinton Clinton seemed to be a breath of fresh air, but by that time he had formed what was called the Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC, and they was a right of center Democratic group that again totally abandoned the working class and what sold out for money. So his 8 years was sort of republicanism light, and there was a slight bounce back in the economy and a slight uptick, a little bit better after 8 years of him for the working class. But he didn't do anything radical to help the poor and the working class. George W. Bush, what can you say about him? He fucked things up so ridiculously, from ignoring warnings about 9/11. He gave giveaways to the rich. His 8 years, I mean, just totally tanked the economy to the point where we almost entered another Great Depression. Obama came and he was basically just a Clinton with a tan. He promised so many things to be liberal and whatnot. He was a con man. And I can't stand Clinton. I can't stand Obama. I can't stand either of the Clintons. I can't stand Obama. Just come out and say you're a fucking Republican. Say you're a right wing motherfucker. Don't pretend. And then now we've got this piece of garbage bilge, Donald Trump, who for 40 years plus, I remember when he got famous in the end of the 70s. Here's a guy who was spoon fed everything. His father built the business, and he did it on the backs of the mafia with his association with the five families of the New York City mafia. So the Trumps, there's a very good reason why they act like a crime family, because they learned from the mafia, and so that's a short history of the president. So yeah, Obama I can say is the best president of my lifetime. Clinton's probably number two, but overall I'd say they were Obama at best was submediocre, and Clinton a notch or two below. So I mean, it's bad, and I don't. And the people I blame the most are the electorate. We keep electing these idiots. We don't have ranked choice voting, so that you can, if you have five candidates running, you can list your first to the fifth choice. We have the electoral college, which is an anachronism that should never have been enacted to begin with. We have a Senate where every state that exists gets the same amount of representation. So you have people in Wyoming we have maybe 6, 7, 800,000 ignorant white folks, ranchers, who are going to be making decisions and have probably about 20 times more power than, say, minority folks who live in the cities.
I believe Wyoming is the least populous state. I think I read it has only 500,000.
Okay, well, that's even worse then.
And then you became a Jill Stein supporter, and I'm curious as to let's take this back to about maybe 2015. Who have been some of your favorite politicians, your favorite third party independent people?
I don't like politicians. I don't even particularly like Jill Stein. I think she was the best of the candidates running. You have to recognize this. Politics at its core is about a small group of people deciding things for a large group of people. And inherently that's unfair. But most people are idiots. The large group of people, if they tried to run things, it would be total anarchy. So you have to have some kind of a government. You know, the old saying about the best leader would be a benign dictator. But go try finding a dictator who's benign. I think Jill Stein was the most competent of the two major parties and the Greens and the Libertarians. Here in Texas, those were the only four that I could vote on the ballot. I sure as hell wasn't going to vote for Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton, I couldn't stand her. I actually liked Hillary Clinton when she first came into public view in 1992, but she became everything her detractors said she was. She wasn't that originally, but lying, paranoid, scheming. I think when she didn't leave Bill, imagine if she had left Bill Clinton after the Monica Lewinsky thing. What a positive statement that could have been for women. But when she didn't, that showed absolutely she was just marrying this piece of shit for power for herself. But so those two, and then you had the libertarian guy Gary Johnson, who's a total psychotic, lives in a fantasy. The American Libertarian Party, they're not civil libertarians. They're pro corporatist. They care about is corporations. And then you had the Greens. I generally have an 85 to 90% agreement with the Greens. There are a few things here and there that I'll disagree with, but Jill Stein was a good, solid Green. I think the guy who's running here in 2020, Howie Hawkins, and he's the leading Green candidate, and a guy named Dario Hunter is the number two guy in their internal polling. Both of them are better candidates. Howie Hawkins basically supports everything Bernie Sanders did and more. I never trusted Bernie Sanders. I thought he was ultimately a coward when he gave up in 2016 and basically muffed dove on Hillary. That was a disgusting act. He betrayed his followers. So I never trusted him. I did say, okay, let's see what happens. Let's give him one more chance. He didn't, and he folded the minute they played around again. I liked Tulsi Gabbard, but again, she's fallen into line. None of these fucking people have the balls to really stand up for things. And Andrew Yang, briefly, I sort of thought he might have a shot with his universal basic income, but Yang's universal basic income is a very rickety, poor universal basic income. There are a number of basic income ways that you can raise funds better, more stably, and there's a thing called a social wealth fund that is better than UBI, that is basically giving everyone a stake in the U.S. as if it was a municipal fund. But these are much more sort of complex and detailed things. So that's where I stand on that. So.
So who do you think would be one of the? I'm going to say this with an asterisk. Who do you think are some of the best options then for this coming election?
Well, right now, as I said, Howie Hawkins, I he's probably going to win the Green nomination, so he would probably be right now my top choice. Um, if something happens or I don't like something there, I'm this fellow I interviewed, Mark Charles, I could vote for. I disagreed with some of the things that he said in my interview with him, but you're not going to agree with everyone. I just interviewed a guy yesterday, was it? Yeah, yesterday or 2 days ago, named Brian Carroll. He's a nice guy, but his party, the American Solidarity Party, is quite liberal. I've got another few uh, minor party candidates that I want to interview, but right now it would probably be uh, Howie Hawkins would be my first choice. My second choice would probably be Mark Charles.
So with that said, pardon me. Okay. So what I wanted to ask now was compared to, because now you live in Austin, Texas, I kind of wanted to ask the disparities between New York, Twin Cities, Minnesota, and Austin, and sort of how the people you feel have evolved politically over time, and the differences in different regions of the United States.
Well, you'd have to talk socially about some of the differences because in New York, most people in New York live in crowded, cramped conditions. This is why COVID hit so hard there. You have attached houses, so you could have people arguing, your neighbors, and you can hear them arguing through the paper thin walls. You know, people would, if you didn't like your neighbor, you'd be like, someone would say, Schneider, fuck you, you motherfucker, and you'd say, suck my ass, Luigi, you cocksucker, and then you'd yell and scream at each other, and the next day you just walk away and say, hey, Luigi, hey, Schneider, how you doing? It was just a natural thing. So there was a much more upfront and honest kind of approach to things, even if it was sometimes seemingly barbaric. When I moved to the Twin Cities is known as the land of 10,000 lakes, but it's also known as the land of 10,000 mental clinics because there's a cultural psychosis there called Minnesota nice, where people, if they hate you or dislike something you said, they won't tell you to your face. They will stew about it for weeks or months sometimes, and then explode on you. I remember just getting a drink. I remember many a time artists that who were Minnesota is generally known as a liberal place, but uh, in the Twin Cities area, it's very liberal. Outstate, outside of the Twin Cities, it's less liberal. Uh, but people there, I think it had to do with the fact that most of the people there were rural. They were on farms, and if you had a farm and it covered, a couple of acres, and the next farm covered 2 or 3 acres, if the snows settled in and you didn't get along with your neighbor, well, the next person that you have to could get along with was maybe 3/4 of a mile down the road, and you might not see them because of the snow. So they were the opposite of New York. Instead of everyone crammed together, there was a lot of space in Minnesota. And so people would put on this veneer of being polite, even if they hated your guts. They'd be like, "Ah, Sven, nice to see you," and then they'd mutter away, "That son of a bitch, I hate him. He did something to me 17 years ago. I'll never forgive him. I hope he dies. I hope he dies." And I remember one of the big shocks was the difference in dating in New York and the Twin Cities. Even in the art scenes, which are liberal. In New York, the last few years before I left, I would go to things. There was a thing called the New Eurekan Poets Cafe. I knew some of the people there, and I'd read there and at some other places. And I'd go to some underground clubs in the 1980s in Brooklyn, and there are a few girls I hooked up with here and there. And it was like, yeah, "Oh, yeah, how you doing, Trina? Hey, how you doing? Oh, wasn't that a great art? Yeah, you want me to suck your cock? Yeah, okay, we'll go out back." In Minnesota, it was far less loosey-goosey, and everything was a trauma. Everything was a drama. There were so many alcoholics, so many drug users, so many people who wouldn't speak their minds, who would play these politically correct games. Here in Texas, I have not really been involved in the social scenes because by the time I moved to Texas, uh, most of my artistic endeavors were engaged online. Early on, the first 2 or 3 years, Jessica and I guess, went to a few bookstores for some readings here or there, but not that much. There really wasn't that much. The poem, the poetry reading renaissance, the slam poetry things of the '90s had long since faded, and I was older. I was married. I'd met Jessica, and uh, here in Texas, the interesting thing is Texas is an odd combination. Texas, the people are more right wing generally. In Austin area, they're more left wing, but here in Texas, they're more right wing. But they're very open right wing. You're not gonna the neighborhood I live in, a subdivision. I've had to on one side of my house, the people who lived in that home. There've been about 5 families there. There was one Hispanic family, one Muslim family. On the other side, there's been 2 or 3 families that have lived in the 17 years we've lived here. I think one of them might have been Hispanic. We have black people, so it's an integrated neighborhood. Yet on a social level, it's very much with this religion. They're anti-union. They hate labor. There's a very much plantation mentality, but not necessarily racially plantation. It's the idea that if you're an individual, you go work for a company, and the company is your plantation. They don't like unions. They don't like people who speak up or speak their mind. You'll find people sitting in Starbucks having Bible groups here in Texas. And yet they're very open. They're very friendly. In Minnesota, the people were politically liberal, but they hated people outsiders. Anyone who wasn't born in Minnesota was an intruder, someone to be feared and scorned. Here in Texas, they'll welcome you, but they'll be, "Well, your boy, you from New York, right? Yeah, okay. Well, you just don't be getting out of line, son. Don't get out of line, and you fit in fine." And that's really, they are more open-minded socially here in Texas, but politically they're more closed-minded. In Minnesota, they are socially awkward and inhibited, but politically open. And in New York, they're politically open, and there's touches of violence, which are echoed sometimes here in Texas. Texas, they love carrying guns. In New York, it's more gang stuff, or it was when I was growing up. So it's different. So when you talk politically, uh, you have to have that social milieu. Texans are more right wing. Although probably it wouldn't shock me by 2030 if there's a Democratic majority takes over, and it's mostly because of Hispanics. Uh, New Mexico, right next door, is a heavily Democratic state, and 15 years ago or so, when we first moved here, it was it was on the fence. Uh, Minnesota is probably going to stay Democratic. New York is famously liberal, but I would like to see many political parties. I just wish people would think, but most people are zombies. Most people are lemmings. So that's it.
Now that we've gone over the three places you've lived and their political disparities, social disparities, what area how would you say political correctness has evolved over time?
It's gotten worse. One of the reasons that my wife Jessica and I are not published in the publishing industry is because of political correctness. Both of us are pale skinned. Neither of us have paid money into the MFA creative writing program frauds. I mean, the MFA mafia, if you will. Um, uh, I will use whatever tools I have available to me. For example, in some of my gang books, my mob books, I have characters use the word nigger or kike or this or that, fag, because this is the way those people talk. Now, I'm not someone who says, "Oh, art has to be truthful or whatnot." That's not just being truthful. That's just the reality. If I'm going to make a good character, you have to show their good sides and their bad sides. Um, so political correctness has gotten bad. It has infected the arts. Political correctness is slowly strangling arts in this country. It is killing the arts. If you go back and look at people who've published first books, I don't think there's anyone that I can think of off the top of my head who've published their first book in the 1980s or later who has ever written a great book or could be considered a great writer. Um, the painting is a little bit better. You can get some great painters here or there. Jiwei Tu is a great painter. I found about 12, 15 years ago with my wife Jessica in a gallery, but he was established. He was a Chinese painter who came to America. Filmmaking still has a little bit of an opportunity to do that, but writing is being slowly strangled and killed. Um, uh, recently, I think I might have mentioned in the last interview that guy who won his second Pulitzer, a black fellow, and I'm not saying because he's black it's politically correct. It's because he writes like crap. And Toni Morrison won a Nobel Prize. She had some good books at the beginning, but nothing great. And then her last 5, 6 books were these short little pieces of shit with titles like Love and horrible, horrible. Um, you know,
It's almost like getting a participation trophy from what it
yeah,
sounds
yeah,
like
exactly.
a
Yeah,
positive message.
I
Oh,
remember.
here we go.
I remember there was this viral video 5 or 6 years ago about a high school wrestling meet, and they had this kid who had won the wrestling tournament wrestle against this kid who was like semi-retarded or maybe and a paraplegic. And what they did is they had the champion wrestler kid just lay on his back in the middle. This, not pro wrestling. This is regular wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling. In the squared in the circle on the floor, he laid down and people lifted the paraplegic kid out of the goddamn chair, threw him on top of the wrestling champ, and they went 1, 2, 3, and they gave him what the fuck is that? How could this kid, he's not retarded, how could this kid feel good thinking that he actually won a wrestling match? This is the insanity that has happened for you're gonna losing is a good thing if you learn from it. Not being victorious, being snubbed for something you can't control, whether it's your race or if it's something like your religion, if something you truly believe in, or your sex or sexual uh, orientation. These are bad things, but for example, I've sent around now many of the plays of the last couple of years to think, and I look at some of these theaters. They're putting on plays that they'll have YouTube videos say, a 3-minute segment from one of the plays they produced last spring or something, and it looks like it was written for a junior high school level or now middle school level. I mean, it's everything is retarded because we want to dumb everything down so that no one feels bad, except those people who are exceptional, who find and take great offense to having their greatness in whatever field they're in dumbed down. You don't do that. Society needs to progress. And I think I mentioned this in the last time we talked. It is those people who are great in something who drag and pull the kicking and screaming moronic masses, whether they like it or not. You need the greats in the arts, in the sciences, in leadership, political or otherwise, to to affect change. If you dumb everything down, you're going to have a society that we have in the last 40 years. And one of the odd things is this dumbing down by the left wing encourages the dumbed down Trump kind of maggots, as they call them, MAGATS, because this thing that was seen by these morons, political correctness, has actually given rise to the stupidity that fuels the very people who hate them. I dislike them because they're intellectually stupid. But these Trump kind of people, they hate the politically correct people because of the color of their skin and other reasons that I mentioned. And so it's a perfect example of these people trying to do something they think is good and ending up being their own worst enemy.
I really wanted to ask you, now that we're in the topic of dumbing down culture, idiocy, political correctness, a very specific thing I came across yesterday. I was reading an article about podcasters having on people that are associated with toxic groups and echo chambers. One of the most famous people right now is Joe Rogan. I don't know how familiar you are
He's an
with.
idiot. He's a NASA moon landing denier. He's basically someone who spent too much time in the MMA ring and got kicked in the head too much. But go ahead.
Well, no, well, I was going to ask more on a general sense. He got criticized for having some very questionable, very probably dangerous people on his
Mm.
podcast, and I was wondering what your opinion on what do you think about having those types of people on a podcast?
Well, it depends on how if he's believing some white racist nonsense. If he had someone like the guys who was it Charles Murray who did that infamous bad book about the uh, black people having lesser IQs. If you have people who are pushing pseudoscience, you have to make a stand and say, "Look, I disagree with it." I told you yesterday I spoke with this fellow or the other day I spoke with this candidate who's running on a party that's pro-life. Now, he was very, he was also in some ways left wing in terms of supporting unions. So he was balanced enough that even when he said things that I didn't agree with, as an interviewer, I'm not going to debate him. I'm going to ask him to explain why. Um, Now, if I have neo Nazis on, they are so far beyond the pale. Number one, I wouldn't have a neo Nazi on. The closest I've come to that is I did an interview 2 or 3, maybe 3 years ago with a guy who was with a men's rights group. And generally, I don't like men's rights people. Most of them are a bunch of mewling pussies. That
Robert Bly was part of it, right?
who?
Robert Bly.
Well, Robert Bly started a different type of men's group. A guy named Paul Elam. I didn't interview him, but he started these uh, uh, MRAs, men going men going their own way, MGTOWs, men going their own way kind of thing. A fellow named Dean Esme, who had a blog back in the early O's, had emailed me 5 or 6 years ago because I had written some responses to him after he had banned me from his website 15 some years ago. I thought he had sent me some viruses to down my computer. He said he didn't do that. He apologized for the way he had treated me. So I invited him. I did a show with him about the blog phenomenon of the aughts, and he seemed like a decent enough guy. But he's someone who was in this men's rights stuff and whatnot. And then a guy had a book out, and either I contacted him or he may have contacted me after Esme was on, and I interviewed him. Now, I did say that there were some things I agreed with them. Men do usually get short shrifted in custody disputes with women, even if the man is clearly the better prospective parent, single parent. On the other hand, like I said, a lot of it's just a lot of pussy shit. It's like be a man, grow up, be an adult, be a man. Stop whining about how bad things are, especially when you don't have it as bad as a lot of other people who have the different colored skin or come from other countries or whatnot. Um, but if like I said, I would never have a neo-Nazi or a skinhead on because I don't feel I owe them anything. But if I were to interview, or if I were being interviewed, if you, for example, for some reason brought on a neo-Nazi, we started debating, well, I'd have to intellectually destroy the guy, and I could smash him like a bug quite easily, but there'd be no point to it because there's no challenge to it. But yeah, I'm not.
You can't argue with an idiot, right?
Well, there's the old saying, you can't argue with an idiot because the idiot will never learn and he'll bring you down to his level. So, I agree with that sentiment generally.
And I love watching your interviews because you are fair, and every interview, good or bad, I always learn something from it. I think you have given fantastic interviews. I think one of the most interesting ones was it the news one? The guy said something about you being racist, and you just kind of like brushed past it.
The
Was
news,
that wasn't
I
there one about was it NPR?
Oh yeah, there was a guy. Yes, I'm almost 300 interviews in. I do remember now vaguely there was something where some guy said something like that, and I just went by. And some of the people on my E list, which I put you on, were like, "Why didn't you take him on?" I
Thank you
said,
so much.
"What? Why would I even dignify that? I'm not going to what if someone if let's say." You had Harold Bloom, or you had some politically correct writer like that fellow who won the Colson Whitehead on. Now, I wouldn't attack him personally or whatnot, but I would say because I did read his Underground Railroad book, I'd say, listen, why don't you pick out the best 5 consecutive paragraphs or so, or the 5 pages from the best writing you've ever done, and I'll pick out my 5 best pages, and we'll see, we'll put it side by side or whatnot. Anyone who knows anything about writing would have to acknowledge I'm a better writer. But someone like that, if he got nasty or something and tried to say, well, my opinion is because I'm a homophobe or a racist or this or that, I'm like, get out of here. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. But if you don't have a real argument, that's what you fall back into. You fall back into just tossing out bullshit about people, straw manning, attacking someone's person rather than their argument, and it's rather easy to see. And when it is that obvious, since you just mentioned this, 4 years later or whatnot, 150 interviews on or whatever it was, why would I even dignify that? There have been times. I remember one time I interviewed a woman about life after death. She believed in life after death, and all of a sudden, I think she started talking about leaving her body and flying past Pluto, and I'm like, oh boy, this is going to get a little crazy.
Billy
Uh,
Pilgrim beliefs.
what?
I said Billy Pilgrim beliefs.
Something like that. But yeah, and but you, if you're an interviewer, the thing you have to do is try to stay on topic and keep the person on topic, keep them lively. There have been times when I've had people who didn't speak much for the first 10, 15 minutes of the interview, but because I was listening, I could bring them out. And by 30 or 40 minutes in, the interview was getting going, and they sort of trusted me, even if they weren't necessarily particularly adept at being interviewed or answering questions. And that's always a challenge, and it's always fun. And you know, I would challenge anyone to look at the Dan Schneider video interviews, especially, and show me any interviewer in any medium, whether it's old time television or here on YouTube, that has as wide a range of subjects. And most of the time, like I don't have anything in front of me. I'm not reading it. I have an interest in something. I interviewed a guy who but had a UFO book. I interviewed a guy who Howard Bloom, fifth or sixth time I've interviewed him. He had a book on his life in pop culture. I interviewed a guy who has had an odd life, including once having sex with a dolphin recently. So I'm yeah.
Oh my god!
Yeah, a guy named Malcolm Brenner. But he was a nice enough guy, and he was an interesting story. So I've interviewed a lot. There's an interview that I did with a guy early on in the first year or two. I think it was, yeah, I think it was about Genghis Khan. Was it? Yeah, it was my interview about Genghis Khan, and he was in a motel in Croatia. He had just woken up after drinking, and you can see he's sitting on the edge of a bed, and he's talking about. Took about 10 minutes to get wound up, but it was brilliant what he said. It was almost like performance art, and each interview is different and whatnot. But I've lost now the topic here. My interviewing skills. I was patting myself on the back a little. What was the actual question?
No, no, I mean, you're obviously a very smart man, so I was just trying to get a lot of information out. Obviously, my skills as an interviewer, they're still in the beginning stages, so forgive me.
Well, you're a good interviewer. I was telling Jessica you're quite a good interviewer. So
Oh, well, thank you very much. But what I wanted to ask was, because this is it can be very scary in terms of how much information is out there. It can be very overwhelming. Colleges, thankfully, have given charts on the best news sources. I've talked to friends about how they literally graph different sources, like this is actually better than this. Don't read this. This is up here. It's left. Economist is better than so and so. Stuff like that. So I'm curious, what NPR is better than whatever. So what is your favorite news sources? What do you think is the best, most reality-driven news sources?
I don't. You have to parallax things. You have to read lots of sources. Parallax is one of the keys to life, which means you step aside and you look at different things and you see what this one says, that one says, that one says, that one, and you get it's sort of like a movie in where you have different frames and images that together give you the illusion of movement. With a parallax, you have slightly different takes on things, but if you leave them all together, you get closer to the truth than any one of them is. It's like the seven blind men and the elephant. One reaches for the tail, thinks it's a rope. The other for the trunk, thinks it's a snake. One reaches for the tusk, thinks it's a spear. Other reaches for the ear, thinks it's a fan. Reaches for the body, thinks it's a wall. Reaches for the legs, thinks it's a tree. But the person who can touch all of those things can see that it's an elephant and gets more of an idea of what an elephant is, even if they're blind. So you have to read a lot, you have to engage a lot, and there are things you have to move beyond your own political biases. As I said, I'm more of a social liberal, a progressive, but I can tell you one of the least trustworthy sources of news out there is a left wing organization called the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I support a lot of what the Southern Poverty Law Center stands for. They were a civil rights group. They keep track of a lot of hate groups, they call them, but they've gotten very politically correct in the last 10 or 15 years, and a lot of right wingers have pointed this out, and they're actually correct on it. In that, if anyone who says anything that disagrees with the liberal or progressive viewpoint is somehow a bigot, and that's simply not so. The fellow I interviewed the other day, as I said, is pro-life, and I can tell you, just because he's pro-life and against abortion, and I disagreed with some of the things he said about abortion scientifically. I think if I were debating him, I could have shown up some of the flaws in his reasoning. But if you listen to the entirety of that interview with him, Brian T. Carroll, the American Solidarity Party, he seems like a very nice, reasonable, and intelligent man. Just because maybe 5% of what he believes in regarding abortions or women's rights in that regard is, I think, not a good belief system, does not negate his overall decency. And this is one of the things that is missed by both the far left and the far right, in that you can have good decency. I'll give you even a further example. You can have people who are bigots, who are irredeemable, and some who are actually decent people. When I was 7 or 8 years old, I was in the Cub Scouts I was at the time going to a Lutheran school. And this kid came from a public school, and he joined the Cub Scouts. And a couple of years later, in sixth grade, I went to the public school. Turned out, well, he and another kid, we were going one weekend to supposedly a picnic. Well, his dad picks us up. We go to this picnic out on Long Island, and we get there, and I see a lot of people in white robes. And then they put on her. And at first I thought, wait a minute, are these people all queer? They're wearing dresses, these guys? And it turned out it was a Klan rally. So I,
Oh, okay.
so I accidentally attended a Klan because this kid's father was like the number 2 or 3 guy in the Long Island Ku Klux Klan. And I'm like, they so I put on this thing. They said, I'm like, what the? I'm like, what? And so I'm like 7, 8 years old. I'm like, what the fuck is this? I've never, I've never seen anything like this guy and his father were irredeemable. But I have known people who were good people, charitable people, who gave to their church and whatnot. But they would say, I just don't like spics, or those Jews who had the money. I can take anyone but a Jew, or uh, you know, I'm sure she's a nice enough girl or whatnot, but she's a nigger. And then you get people, for example, who would be nice and decent, and they would, for example, have a black friend, and I'd say, but I thought you don't like black people. Oh yeah, but Bobby Joe, he's not a real nigger. That's that kind of so. But
Yeah, now.
the point is, both of those are equally racist. The Ku Klux Klan leader and the ignorant person. But the ignorant person could be a good, decent person. They would never string up a black person. They would never bomb a Jewish synagogue. But they had their bigotries. The real out out the front door racist. Those people are troubling. But in terms of the social stuff, I'd rather deal with the out and out racist than the person who pretends that they're not but really is. It's the people who are the sneaky ones, the people who pretend that they're not what they really are, that do more damage long term, even though they might be good people. Now, some of those people are redeemable. I've known people who hated blacks or Muslims or Jews or American Indians or whatever, and came around to it and said, God, they're 45 and they're like, man, when I was 25 years old, I was an asshole. And they've had maybe swastikas on their tattooed on their arm that they got removed, and so that can happen. Um, so anyway, again, I'm going off. I'm in preacher mode here.
No, no, no. It's okay because I want to hear the knowledge, the opinions. I think
Yeah,
that's important. Well, what's fascinating to me is the duplicity that lots of people have. I was recently reading Philip Zimbardo's what's it called, The Lucifer Effect. I'm not
yeah,
sure if you had read that book
yes,
ever.
yes, yeah.
And
I interviewed
it's
Philip Zimbardo back in '03 on a radio program, so
oh really? How did that go?
he's a very interesting guy. Uh, it's on. You can actually listen to it. It's on E-Cosmoetica, I think, the Omniversica shows. You'll see it.
Gotcha. No, I was going to say it's really amazing to me how people, especially, and I think great art, great stories, like even like reading something like Your Own Tumbleweeds or Tree Grows in Brooklyn, or even like the absolute best of Steinbeck. It's amazing how people have this duplicity. They have this aspect to them where they can just it's not they're neither good nor bad. It's like they have tendencies and what they act upon. I forgot. I can't remember what religion it is. There's some belief that's like somebody has two wolves and one wolf's good and one wolf's bad, and whatever you feed is the better one.
Mm.
I can't remember, but I recommend somebody research that. So, and I just wanted to hear your opinion based on where you live. What do you think about people inherently good, people inherently evil? What do you think?
It's all across the spectrum. There are no monoliths. I think people generally are self-centered, and that's evolutionarily wired into us. The most important thing for any living organism is to stay alive. Um, that we have tendencies for selflessness for our wives, our husbands, our lovers, our children, our grandparents, our friends, our greater community. That's something that's less predictable. The bad is predictable because, you know, the monkey that was greedy and hid bananas from the rest of the troop, when the bananas when there was a drought, he had bananas stashed away, or maybe nuts stashed away, and he could survive and pass on his genes. So duplicity, deception, lies are good evolutionary strategies. There's a reason why leaders tend to be, well, most political leaders at least, tend to have a lot of the characteristics that we generally associate with now sociopaths and, to an extreme example, psychopaths. You have to be sort of narcissistic. Hillary Clinton is a narcissist. Trump is a narcissist. Bill Clinton's a narcissist. Obama is probably a lesser version of it, but he has narcissism. Think of any major politician. They're narcissists. And think of these CEOs. They don't do anything really. I was just reading something on Twitter a couple of hours ago about Elon Musk. That guy is a flaming narcissist. And he himself isn't inventing anything. He's got the money and he pays people, but he himself is not doing anything. Now, it's good to have investments in stuff and if you're doing positive things, but he's not doing it for the betterment of the world. He's doing it so that Elon Musk, is known throughout history. But no one remembers these stuff. Here's a thing I've said many times and a few times on video. I'm going to give you 3 names, and you tell me if you've ever heard of them, okay?
Okay.
William Shakespeare.
Yes.
You've heard of him.
Yes.
Pablo Picasso.
Yes.
Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah, of course.
3 people. Okay, now, tell me, who was the governor of the province or the top politician in the local area when Shakespeare was born? Do you know?
I do not.
Who was the richest man in the province of Spain when Picasso was born?
I do not.
And who was the leading district attorney in New York City when Stanley Kubrick was born?
I do not know.
Now, all 3 of those people were in far better positions than Shakespeare, Picasso, and Kubrick. But no one remembers them because ultimately the things they did had no or very little consequence going forward. Shakespeare, even though I think he's overall overrated, was still a great artist and has had obvious impact. Same can be said of Picasso. Maybe in the visual arts, one could even argue Picasso is even more dominant in the last 100 years than Shakespeare. And Kubrick, of course, is one of the top 5 or 10 filmmakers of all time. And filmmaking is a far more complex art than painting, and in some ways almost equal to writing. So here are guys who are doing things that in 500, 1,000 years from now, and hopefully if mankind goes beyond that, are still going to be known. But no one gives a shit about who the richest motherfucker was. No one gives a shit about some minor prefecture's governor or satrap. No one gives a shit about the guy who was the most famed prosecutor or the guy who, invented some minor. These things ultimately don't matter. Society, whether we recognize it or not, ultimately knows what it should value, but individuals as a whole don't. We can look up the Einsteins and the Newtons as well, science as well as the arts. These people contributed things. The rest just falls away because anyone could do it. Anyone could be Elon Musk. Elon Musk didn't make all the money by himself. Elon Musk inherited, I think it was an emerald mine. Go ahead.
You finished?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it is amazing because the only time I think of, I mean, I can't. The only scientists I ever really know of are like the super famous change, like paradigm shifting type of scientists or inventors. But when it comes to artists, I know way more. I can remember the name of way more artists, way more of their contributions, and people that aren't even famous. Like I can remember.
Well, the arts. I've said this before, and people don't like it, but the arts are more important than the sciences for a very simple reason. Science is about what is already out there. It is about discovering what's already out there. Anyone can do it. If you look in history, any famous scientist usually has several rivals that he is best at. Meaning, you have Charles Darwin. Well, you also had what's his name?
Wallace, right?
Yeah, Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace. If you have Newton, guess what? Newton made calculus. You have Leibniz. You have Edison. You have Tesla. You have and on and on. There's always a group or a pair of guys that, but there's no one. There is no one who could bested John Donne and his religious poems. Donne was a much better poet than Shakespeare, and the more I read Donne, I, I I I think people are retarded that they think Shakespeare's even on his level. But look at Melville. Without Melville, there's not. You could go through an infinity minus one universes. There's never going to be a Moby Dick without Herman Melville. Without Stanley Kubrick, there is no 2001. There's no Doctor Strangelove, and in an infinity minus one universes, you are not going to have either of those films. They a great artist is irreplaceable. It's irreducible. There's no Norwegian in the Family without Dan Schneider. There's none of my. I don't know if I had sent you that 3,300 page poem. Did I send you that PDF of 3,300 pages of my poems? There's nothing like that,
I,
and you
was
did
gonna
get
say
them.
I didn't. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was gonna say I didn't get the poems. I got the other books.
Okay, I'll have to send you the poems. But anyway, go ahead. Continue.
Well, well, what I think is interesting is the timelessness of great art. The other day, and I want to put this into perspective. So my family is Italian, right? And I live in California. I did not, in terms of, I don't really have any friends that are, Japanese or anything in that culture that I'm too familiar with. But I put on an Ozu movie. I put on, was it An Autumn Afternoon? Is that the title of it?
Yeah, that's one of the films. I can never remember which one is which because its titles are so similar. Then they're different than the actual Japanese titles. But
Well, that one was, I think, his last movie. It was in color.
oh yeah.
From the dad's perspective of
Mm.
marrying the daughter, not the daughter's, but the dad's perspective. And I felt, I mean, the entire, it's labeled as a drama movie. Like if you go on Wikipedia and you do like a short synopsis, but it's more than that. It talks about a wide span of human emotion. It's not
Mm.
just drama. There's a lot of laughs in that movie. And I had it evoked in me such an emotion that I never. It was just one of those lovely times to really be alive and say, "Wow, life."
Mm.
And again, like this is from 1960s. It's in Japan, but here in 2020, me, that's a person of Italian descent living in California, I'm relating to it, and it's absolutely beautiful. And that's the timelessness of great art.
Mm. Well, Ozu is my favorite filmmaker. He's not the greatest filmmaker. He's a great filmmaker, but he's not the greatest, I don't think. But he's my favorite. And I thought you said you were something else other than Italian when we last
Oh,
spoke.
I said the last name is probably some type of Spanish butchered over time
Oh,
or
okay.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean that's what art does. It bridges the gap. You want to know, like I think I mentioned, if you want to know a little bit about what Japan was like 1,000 or so years ago, read Tale of Genji, Lady Murakami, a woman who was in one of the, was it the, I don't know if the emperor was it an emperor or was it at the time a shogun, but she was in the Japanese court. She wrote this long book. It's not great by modern standards, but it's a leap above uh, anything that had come in Japan before, even in the whole Orient, as far as I know. Um, and that's what it does. In 5,000 years, like I said, if someone wants to know what being a human being was like in the late 20th, early 21st century, I think there's only one person to read, and you're looking at him. The second person would be my wife, Jessica. But if you want the whole full experience, you read Dan Schneider. And I'll just state that. When you finish Tumbleweeds and then you go to the Vincetti brothers, you'll notice as great as Tumbleweeds is, you are in a new universe with Vincetti brothers. And then when you finish Vincetti brothers, and if you read on Norwegian the Family, you're going. I mean, you're like 10 dimensions above. And it'll be a profound experience if I'm getting a sense of who you are.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, art to me is what I need. Like, and it's not necessarily I'm going to be like, I don't know if I'm going to be like the world's greatest whatever. Probably not. But art to me is very important, and it makes me open my mind up. I think I read somewhere Kurt Vonnegut. I think I had to do a project on him. I feel like I think I read somewhere he said the purpose of art is to like evoke an emotion you didn't know you have, or
Mm,
something like that. And great art does that,
mm,
and it makes me a better person. It makes me more in tune with life, and it makes me smarter. And that's
yeah.
and and I feel like bad art is not able to do that.
Yeah, I would just disagree that if he used the imperative that it must or what it can. Art doesn't have to be beautiful. Uh, art doesn't have to invoke a deep emotion. Art can stimulate you just intellectually. This is one of the things where I was talking about polyvalence or multivalence.
Oh yeah, of
I
course.
believe in that it can work on many levels.
So I really wanted to ask you, what interviews have had the strongest impact on you as a person? The Dan Schneider video interviews, I should say.
I mean, if you're talking anything profound, none. If you're talking about things that I've enjoyed, uh, I mentioned some of the people that I've drawn out of shells. I enjoyed that. There was a guy who recorded his dreams for 40 plus years. He was an interesting interview. This guy who had sex with a dolphin was an interesting interview. Um, uh, my favorites are probably some of the interviews where I have two or three people panels, and I haven't had many of them in the last 15, 20 interviews because with this COVID stuff, it's getting more difficult. But I did a couple of really great interviews on horror film. One was about 2 hours and 45 minutes on horror films with two guys, and then two other guys I did on monster movies. And so you have about 5.5 hours of talking about monster and horror films. And it's just terrific because these guys were these, so pop culturally smart. I probably agreed to with probably about 95 to 98% of their opinions on the films and why they were. Um, it's such a primitive. If you want to know about monster or horror films, watch that. Same thing with some other things I've done. I enjoyed doing these series, these trilogies that I did with on topics like death or loneliness or whatever it was, and I'd have a theologian, a scientist, and a scientist talking about the same topics. So you could have these, the death trilogy, say. Those were interesting, and I especially enjoyed probably talking with the actors on acting, especially with some of the female actresses. One woman, Kathleen Gaddy from a soap opera called General Hospital. God, she was so open and one I really enjoyed talking with her. Another gal that I interviewed had been on LA Law, Michelle Green. That's my longest interview, 3 hours and like 22 seconds or something. She could have gone another 2 or 3 hours. And if we were both single and we were living in the same area, I would have probably asked her out after the interview because she just seemed so interesting and fascinating, and I found her very attractive. Um, and a few other the women that I've interviewed, because the women even more so than the men would open up personally, and so you're getting not just a topical interview but a personal interview, and so those are probably my favorites. But there are no interviews that I would say that are earth shaking, that are going to change your mind about or change my mind about this, that, or the other thing.
So there have been none that have emotionally impacted you, but there are more like interesting, like like I can think about this, like you can ruminate over it.
Yeah, I mean and that's the purpose of talking with someone about a topic, especially when I learn something, whether it's talking about Genghis Khan or other aspects. I did one interview I remember about what who was more important to the winning of World War II, the Soviet Union or the U.S. That was an interesting kind of debate. And I've done so many, I don't even remember all of them, but I've enjoyed probably, maybe there were 4 or 5 interviews that were I didn't particularly have an enjoyment for, but they weren't bad, and I don't think there's really aside from some technical issues early on, and occasionally when people would have subpar equipment on their, or use an 8-year-old laptop computer, and then they'd complain about, oh, why isn't my image perfect or my voice right? Well, you're using a fucking uh, 2010 laptop, and But anyway, I I enjoy it, and I think it's my interviews are again, show me better interviews with more interesting people.
This is. I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase this. I was recently reading because I believe he did a written interview with him, Steven Pinker,
Mm.
and it sounds to me so far from what I can gather, Steven Pinker, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you agree with him things as a scientist, but not so much from an artist standpoint.
Well, I mean, One of the problems I think that Pinker and some other scientists have is when they stray outside the fields of expertise. Jared Diamond was a botanist, and he not a botanist. He was an what is entomologist, insects, and he wrote books on human evolution. He made some interesting points, and I think there's been scientists who attack him not because they think that he's really wrong, because he might not be in the overall thesis. There might be little points here or there that he's wrong on, but because they didn't have the balls to come out and bring that kind of a vision. Same thing with someone like Pinker. But yeah, Pinker doesn't know anything about art. I did an interview with a guy on the E-list, Alex Sherman, and another fellow, and they were both taking apart Pinker's views on assorted things. And Pinker, for example, his wife, I think it's his second wife, she's not a particularly good writer herself. I don't even remember her name off the top of my head, but they had pointed out a few of the things in this book that Pinker had written about what good writing is. Now, Pinker, I'm sorry, you can know all you want to know about language, but that doesn't give you any clue or insight into creative writing. It just doesn't. You can know the MLS Chicago Manual of Style and how to write a good business letter. That doesn't mean you can write Moby Dick, and not understanding the difference between that is sort of a little bit of shocking that Pinker would fall into some traps like that. But again, he's outside his expertise. If you wanted me, if someone asked me to write a book on the history of backgammon, it would probably not be that good because I'd be dull. I mean, I could make it at least passable reading, but I wouldn't be interested in it. So why would I do it? Most people don't have that bit of self restraint that I have. I don't stray outside of things that don't interest me or that I don't know.
What did you think of his book, though, not intellectually, scientifically, the one with the stats, Better Angels of Our Nature, and Enlightenment Now?
Uh, it's been. I read so much. I vaguely remember them. It's one of these things people sometimes ask me. In an essay that you wrote in 2002, you stated this, and I'm like, that's fucking 18 years ago. I don't remember. I haven't read it for 18 years. Uh, I, I expressed my view there. It's all there. I forgot. I mean, really, because I read so much, especially on like Project Gutenberg and whatnot. Yeah, I can't. I don't remember the specifics of the book. Read what I wrote there, and that's what I thought.
Oh, well, I didn't see you review Enlightenment Now. That's why I was asking.
I don't know if I've even read it. Maybe I may have. I don't know.
Okay. But the reason I brought him up was because you did, it was like very short. I think you only did one or two, Visionary or Fraud. And I thought he would have been a fantastic candidate for that.
Yeah, and that's a good example. Those interviews, people don't want to debate. People and so I would have loved to have done more of them. I had 6 or 7 topics, but most people are cowards. They don't want to go, especially the intellectuals and academics. They're cowards. They don't want to say anything negative. Fuck them. The hell with it.
Oh, wow. I was going to, so, but if we're talking about visionaries or frauds, and as a smart person like yourself, who do you think are, I'm not even talking about artistically, are there any particularly famous intellectuals that you like in today's world? Like, are there any famous philosophers or famous writers, not artists, but people like that that you have a particular liking for?
Well, I've said this before. Don't use a term like like. Like implies an emotional connection. Do I respect or think someone is intellectually? I mean, Ralph Nader. If you were to, I've said this before. The greatest American, politically speaking, of the last 50 years is Ralph Nader, bar none. Ralph Nader has saved literally tens of millions of American lives with his political crusades. He is the most honest man in American politics. Um, if Ralph Nader said something and I didn't have the ability to fact check it, I'd say, well, it's Ralph Nader. I'm going to go with him. So that he's probably the one guy I would say politically, socially is a visionary. In the sciences, most of the scientists nowadays, a lot of the big things have been discovered. So you're not when we're not talking about grand unified theory. The most famous scientist of the last 50 years was Stephen Hawking. but Stephen Hawking was a pipsqueak in terms of physics. He wasn't in a league with Einstein or Niels Bohr. If he hadn't had ALS, no one would know who he was. He was a perfect example of someone whose fame was gotten for something other than his intellect or anything that he actually achieved in his field. I'm not saying he was stupid or a bad human being or whatever else, but if he wasn't in that wheelchair and wasn't a quadriplegic and all shrunken up, no one would know or care of anything he said or wrote.
That's really interesting. I've never really heard that criticism on Hawking's before. So, you don't think he is in the league with some of the great scientific minds then?
No. What is his accomplishment? He didn't. I mean, the only thing people know about Hawking or will know about him is Hawking radiation. That black holes supposedly slowly leak radiation over time, and over trillions or quadrillions of years, they will be the last things that have any energy that escapes into the cold, dead, and lifeless universe, according to current theories. So, but that's hardly discovering a planet. That's hardly the Copernican revolution. That's hardly the Einsteinian or Newtonian revolutions. He basically, if Einstein were a great painter and Newton were a great painter, Stephen Hawking would be a third-rate cartoonist.
Gotcha. So, but one of the things that I find interesting is generational differences in terms of not just the arts but also the sciences. Because clearly, your generation was Carl Sagan, and for my generation, it was probably because he had his version of the cosmos, Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Mm.
And I know that from what I watched of you, you said that you felt he was kind of aping off of Carl Sagan.
Well, Tyson, I mean, Tyson, yeah, he's not as original. He's nothing is done as original. The thing that gets me with Tyson, and I've seen videos of him hosting conferences, and he tries to be funny and he tries to entertain. And when I see him, I'm like, dude, you're the only black guy there, and sometimes he's dancing, he's trying to be fun. It's like you don't have to be fucking Eddie Murphy. It's like you try being an actual intellectual. Stop feeling like you have to entertain people. There are sometimes I've seen him and I just cringe because I'm like, this guy doesn't realize that he's falling into these racist traps here. I would be embarrassed for him sometimes. It's like, dude, you're an intelligent guy. Don't fucking fall into this. You don't have to entertain. Put something intellectually out there. But he's always he probably has one of these personalities where he needs to be liked. And when people
Yeah, I got you.
when people feel a need to be liked, they're in trouble. I don't. I prefer to be liked than not liked, but I really don't give a damn if people like me. No one gives a damn that Rilke was not a good guy. Who cares if people liked him or not? We talked about this a little bit the last time. No one gives a shit about these are ephemeral things. I'm not saying that Neil deGrasse Tyson has to be an asshole, but you don't just you don't have to be Bill Bojangles Robinson. You don't know who that is probably, but you don't have to be a step and fetch it. And when I see the way he acts, sometimes I'm like, this guy, he just doesn't get certain things emotionally. I'm sure he's intelligent, very intelligent, but he doesn't get things at a certain level.
So it's almost as if you think, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, it almost seems you feel, not feel, you think that he's almost more of a showman, or he's trying to be more
He's
of a
trying to,
showman.
but he's not good. It's sort of like he is to showbiz what Tom Cruise is to acting. Not much.
Oh, wow, that was a burn. Oh, I mean, Tom Cruise, he can do some stuff, though.
Yeah, if he's playing a zombie like in the last Kubrick movie, then he's passable. But put him in an actual challenging role, he's not going to impress.
You weren't a fan of his performance in Magnolia?
And no, Magnolia was a movie that had some moments here or there. You said you were a Paul Thomas Anderson fan, so
Well, loosely. Sometimes I really like his stuff, sometimes not so much. Like, you can feel free to criticize. I'm open to new ideas.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything of him for about 15 years because what was the last one he did? Did he did no? Did he do No Country for Old Men?
No, that was the Coen brothers. That was
Oh,
no seven. That was the same year as There Will Be Blood.
Blood Simple. Okay, no, yeah. What was the one with the guy and it ends with the bowling alley? Was that Anderson? The
Oh, that's Big Lebowski.
No, no,
That's
no, 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 no. Not the ball. It's the guy from Texas, and it's uh, I think it's Paul Thomas Anderson. He did a very dark one, similar to the Coen Brothers movies around the same time. I can't remember the movie, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Go ahead.
Oh no no no! I was just curious.
Oh, There Will Be Blood.
That's
That's
yes.
yeah. That's Anderson. Uh,
Yeah, I wasn't. And that movie was actually one of his weaker ones. I didn't even remember the ending where the guy beats the crap out of him in the bowling alley. I didn't
mm,
even remember that.
mm.
That was probably one of his weaker ones. I think that his. I think he, and he did one after that, which I thought was more interesting. I'm not saying it was a great movie, but he did one called The Master. I'm not sure if you're familiar with
No,
that one.
no,
You're not?
no.
I recommend checking that one out. And actually, while we're here, I did want to. I am curious. Why aren't you doing more film reviews? I think
I'm
the
not
last.
watching movies. I have limited time. I'm a mortal being. I don't, and one of the things I also said, I've said before, is that how many times can I point at the most obvious things in movies, or in reviews of books? I mean, how many times can I point out this is cliche? If I'm reviewing Crash or Brokeback Mountain, and then you have, Slumdog Millionaire, or if I'm reviewing Batman, The Dark Knight, or something. How many times can I state the obvious that Heath Ledger does not give a good acting performance? It's barely acting. It's just over the top ranting and raving. I mean, you get to a point. It's like I wrote something like 1,200, 1,300 essays, probably about 750, 800 of them are film reviews. I'm not a film critic in the sense that that's the only thing I do. And you get kind of tired and bored with it. How many times can you talk about the most obvious things and people don't get it? Well, if people don't get it, fuck it. I don't care. And plus, I'm more of a creative artist, and as time has shrunk, the critical stuff has to go because I'm the artist. It's much more important for me to write great plays or great novels than it is to write criticism.
I understand. That is a very that makes total logical sense. I've always loved your film reviews and your literature. I think it's probably because I'm more partial to film. That's why that always kind of stood out to me more.
Mm,
But that's just because of my heart's with movies. You know what I mean? That's
mm.
that's that's a personal thing. That's different. But I I think it is interesting because they're still there still are opportunities. There still are different more independent things that are being made. There are things that aren't just the typical Hollywood tripe. That
Mm,
is, I do think that is unique and worth giving a shot, though.
mm.
But I agree with you. After a certain point, going to the theater does seem nonsensical when you have to see, Transformers 9 or whatever. So last time I was on the topic of different intellectuals that are frauds, not so much frauds, and you brought up that a lot of people don't like to debate, which is problematic because more people should be debating on your Dan Schneider interviews. That'd be very interesting. Um, but what I think, I did want to ask you a generational question though, because we started talking about Neil deGrasse Tyson and how he's more of a showman who's not very good at being a showman. And I was curious as to what what do you think in terms of being a generational thing for children? Because I think it's important for kids to learn and to get immersed in the arts and sciences. Because I think that probably one of the beneficial things, I'm assuming you would agree with me, is that Tyson is popular and kids would ultimately take a liking to him, right? And I mean, kids do need to get exposure to the arts and
I,
sciences, no?
I have no idea what kids today would like. Back in the 90s, Bill Nye was interesting. I remember a few years ago, um, there was a science thing that's called like Exploration Planet, which is an independent show, and one of them is the grandson of Jacques Cousteau, the famous oceanographer. Um, and then there's like the space gal. There's really very attractive young brunette woman named Emily Calandrelli. They call her the Space Girl. or whatnot. Uh, but even there, it's like these science shows. One is the grandson of a famous scientist who was a celebrity back in the '60s, and the other one is this, you know, sexy young girl who, I'm sure she's very smart. She seems to be very smart, but everything has to be sort of dumbed down. And whether it's Tyson and his antics, whether it's the celebrity grandson, or whether it's, this cute little woman who's the woman isn't fat. She's not ugly. She's very easy on the eyes. This is what everything gets boiled down to: sex appeal, celebrity, and goofiness. Um, you don't see that on these interviews that I do. Just like with my art, I talk up to people. I don't talk down to people. I assume that if you're going to watch this, you're going to be intelligent, and that's why most of my videos that are a year or two old or older might only have a few hundred hits of views. Some of them have over 10,000. I think there's maybe 5 or 6 that have over 10,000. I have not ever made a dime off of YouTube. I don't expect to. I didn't start it to. But it is kind of disappointing because YouTube is so lowest common denominator. I mean, I still get my website still gets a bit more hits on the writing, even though I haven't added anything written to it for 4 years, 4.5 years now, 4 years, whatever it is. And yet, probably 100th that I've got as a 1/100th the viewership on YouTube as I do online with the written stuff, because YouTube is even dumber. I mean, YouTube is so filled with crap. I mean, I just think of all of the literally now probably a billion or more, billions maybe, of man hours that are on YouTube producing nothing.
Oh, and there's also lots of the TED videos, which some are okay, and then some start to bleed into pseudoscience,
Well,
and
yeah,
then there's
The TED videos are atrocious. Those from the early years, the first 3 or 4 years, had serious scientists on. There's a guy named Jason something or other who's always like one of these, yo, dude, yeah, this is he's science with a blast and a moments shots of awe. I forget the guy's name, but he does his own videos, shots of awe. There's this guy who does the School of Life. This bald idiot from Europe who, again, inherited hundreds of millions of dollars from his banker father, and he puts out these videos with little cartoons that are so condescending. They're so filled with misinformation, and he'll get 250,000 hits in a couple of weeks and for his stuff, and it's like I can't compete in the short term with these people. But the good thing is quality does rise. In every sphere of human endeavor, quality rises. And when I'm dead and the bald idiot is dead and all of these people who are making all this crap are dead, no one's going to give a shit that a great interview I had with so and so was a YouTube interview initially. They will only care that it's interesting. All the rest will fall away. 99.99999% of YouTube will fall away. 99.9999% of blogs will fall away. The people who are cyber archaeologists, which is an actual profession, will troll through this stuff and they'll be like, why didn't people understand the value of Cosmoetica then? The same reason they don't understand the value of Dan Schneider or my wife Jessica Schneider as writers now. People never appreciate what they have when they have it. It's just the simian stupidity that we have.
well, and I think it's important, and I'm not necessarily saying this sycophantically. I'm saying this objectively. Your stuff is quality, and it's made me more open minded, and I think it's brilliant. It's interesting because that contrasts heavily with some of the other crap that's on YouTube, some of the lowest common denominator stuff. And what's even more sad to me is there's a series called Masterclass,
Oh,
which is exceeding. Are you familiar with it?
I heard of it. Yeah,
It is exceedingly hit and miss. It depends on what field you're going into, but you have to pay for it.
yeah.
And again, I don't want to shit on it. I don't want to praise it. It depends on who you get. But then there are people like that one guy who's giving a master class. What's the name? The guy who wrote the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, yeah. I think,
You're like,
yeah, I know. And Ron Howard is giving one on film.
You're like, why do I have to pay money to hear these people talk about that? And then
Yeah,
you're
Dan
just like,
Brown, the Da Vinci Code, and I've seen the Ron Howard one. It's like, Ron Howard, why don't you? I mean, even though he isn't, his last movie, from what people said, wasn't that good. The guy who did 12 Years a Slave, um, should be,
so Steve McQueen.
yeah, Steve McQueen. He should be doing that. I mean, Ron Howard, again, nice guy, no real understanding of art.
But I'm getting a master class here, and that's fantastic, and I want
Mm.
to thank you for that. But I am curious because an ad came up earlier. One was Margaret Atwood master class.
Ugh.
I wanted to get your opinion on what do you think of Margaret Atwood as a writer?
Her poetry is prose disguised as poetry. I did read The Handmaid's Tale. And I think I might have her selected short stories. I think I read them. If I don't have her short stories, I might have. Um, she's not as good as Ursula Le Guin. Ursula Le Guin is a better sci-fi writer. But Margaret Atwood, again, she's one of these people that will just be a name. She can win all the fucking awards. It's not going to matter. If you want to read a dystopian novel, read my sci-fi novel, The Edge of the Shown. That the best dystopias are dystopias where people don't realize they're in dystopias. Um,
Would you consider that to be like a Brave New World situation where it's kind of like is it dystopia? People are happy.
The Handmaid's Tale. I mean,
No. I was just saying what you were saying earlier. Where people don't know it's dystopia. That's what I
well,
was.
the Star Trek, the Star Trek universe, that's a dystopia, and the people in the Federation are so clueless as to how awful they have it. At least we're talking the classic, the first 4 or 5 series. I haven't watched the latest stuff with the Picard and the Discovery or whatnot, but up until the year 2000 or so, I mean, the whole Star Trek Federation, that's a dystopia. These people are narcotized in that society. You don't have to have the fucking Star Wars stuff. Obviously, that's a dictatorship. I mean, and it's even less equality than Star Trek. But Star Trek, I mean, I wouldn't want to serve under Jean-Luc Picard. I wouldn't want to serve with William Riker. There's a great episode uh, of Star Trek where Picard gets captured by the Cardassians and gets tortured by them, and Riker has to deal with another captain played by the guy who was on Total Recall, whose name slips on it, Ronnie something or other, Ronnie Cox. And Ronnie Cox plays this really by the numbers captain, and it shows what a good captain could be like. Jean-Luc Picard is not a good leader. He's not a good captain. Uh, this Ronnie Cox was a much better captain. He could listen to his people, but he also knew when to discipline them. If I were the captain of the Star Trek, the Picard era Star Trek, I would have gotten rid of Riker long ago. I would have gotten rid of most of those lazy bastards. At least in the Kirk era, these people were living human beings. They lusted. Kirk, for all you want to say about Kirk, he knew when there was a good piece of ass going by, and he had to get some. Picard, that was too politically correct. And yeah, anyway.
I'm really shocked by that. I'm surprised. Well, I mean, I like the original series, and personally, it's not the best, but I'm a Deep Space Nine guy
Mhm.
myself. I thought DS9 had the most. I always thought that show had the most complex characters. Like
Yes, it does. The last 3 seasons or so with the Dominion War is probably the best of Star Trek. The problem though is the captain, what's his name, the black
Cisco.
Cisco, the actor Avery Brooks, over dramatic, melodramatic. The best ones was I interviewed one of the guys who's the Cardassians who played Damar. Did you see that one?
I did not. No, I
Yeah,
didn't know that. Wow.
it's about 8 or 10 interviews from my current one. If you go back 270 stuff, uh, the name of the fellow slips on, but a really interesting fellow. I interviewed him. The guy who played the Gul Dukat, great actor, and Andrew Robinson was Garrick. I forget who played Gul Dukat, and this other guy Damar. Those were the three best actors, and those were the three best characters. The human characters in Deep Space Nine were dull as shit. Who gives a shit about Bashir? Who gives a shit about O'Brien? Who gives a shit about Cisco? I couldn't stand any of them. Actually, I thought after the first series, I thought Voyager actually had the best overall cast, though. And even though she was brought on just for sex appeal, I thought Jerry Ryan was very good. I thought Janeway was good. The Tuvok character was very good. Um, it had, I think, the deepest, and the doctor, the holographic doctor, played by Robert Picardo, was excellent. Um, uh, it it was Star Trek. It was the closest to the original Kirk Star Trek that we had. So if I were to rank, and I haven't seen the new Picard or the Discovery
No,
shows,
I do not watch the new stuff.
yeah,
It's so bad.
but
The
it
guy who's producing new Star Trek is the same guy who used to work on the Michael Bay Transformers movies.
yeah, and the showrunner of the Picard one is the guy who did Cavalier and Clay, Michael Chabon, which was a mediocre book at best. But uh, if I were to rank the Star Treks, the best one is obviously the original show. The second best one overall is the animated series, which used recycled scripts from the original show. That the second best live human one, I think, is Voyager, and then I think you could make it's a coin toss between Deep Space Nine and Next Generation as to number four. And the worst one that I watched was that Enterprise. That was atrocious.
It's funny because lots of my friends that are Star Trek fans are joking that remember when we thought Enterprise was bad?
Yeah.
Yeah, those were the
Well, I
days.
saw I saw the first episode of that the Discovery Online with the black character who's Spock's half sister or adopted sister, whatever. And that was just bad. She's not a good actress, at least there. And I've seen some clips of it. The Picard show, I've seen a few clips of it. It's like, why must everything be made dark? It doesn't make it more dramatic to make characters dark. I see this in soap operas. I see this whenever they want to a great show from the 60s, The Prisoner. They remade it in 2012 or 2013 as a 5 or 6 episode miniseries. It was terrible. It was terrible. It had the guy who played Jesus Christ in The Passion of Christ, the guy who was in The Thin Red Line. I can't remember his name now. But anyway, making something dark doesn't make it deeper or better. It just makes it darker and more juvenile generally.
And they're sacrificing logic because there are scenes that make absolutely no sense that they want for attention. Like they have Romulan ninjas wearing motorcycle jackets and they're throwing knives, and then they're leaving the knives.
Yeah.
They're leaving a crime scene
Well,
there.
this is one of the problems with Hollywood too. Is the whole thing about the babe in heels. Yeah, because I really believe that Jerry Ryan in her catsuit in heels could beat the shit out of a 300 pound, Dwayne the Rock Johnson or something. Give me a break. Look, I remember when Ronda Rousey was in the UFCW a few years ago, and people were trying to argue that she could beat Floyd Mayweather, who was the welterweight. I think he was the welterweight or the middleweight champion of the world boxing world. I'm like, are you kidding me? Give me 1 month with a UFCW trainer, and I'll beat Ronda Rousey 99 times out of 100, even given that she's 20 years younger than me. Why? Because I'm a man. I'm taller. I'm stronger. I have a longer reach. Just give me the training and and proper nutrition for a month, and I'll destroy. And even without that proper training, if I had to fight Ronda Rousey in a street fight, not now, she's pregnant or whatnot, I think, but a few years ago when she was in top shape, I could probably still take her 4 times out of 10, even with her expertise in martial arts. Why? Because I'm a man. I'm bigger and I'm stronger. And I'm not in any way a great fighter, never been a great fighter, but I can hold my own against most people my size. But, anyway, we're getting off topic.
No, I mean that's really important. And I think part of the problem with a lot of the Hollywood stuff, like you see in new Star Trek, is they there is no logical grounding, and even yes, it's science fiction, but there's no logical grounding that even makes sense. You can't even suspend your disbelief. And I mean, I was watching the new, I think it was like the new Predator movie. I don't know if you're familiar with the Predator films.
No, I've given up on them.
Yeah, and there was, I don't even remember, but the people have like normal people kind of have superpowers and they can just like fight a predator, but then there's like trained people and it's just a mess.